This is punishment for stealing my father from me. Sunday said these words in the middle of our argument, and there was such fury in her voice that I was speechless for a moment. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin like steel claws, and, ignoring my protests, dragged me outside. The cold wind whipped at her face, but it did not cool her impulse. Like a storm, she dragged me further and further until I realized that I was in front of a massive door to the basement. The door seemed ancient, covered with a web of cracks, and its metal handle was cold to the fingers. Before I could protest, Sunday pushed me inside. I stumbled and fell onto a hard concrete surface covered with a layer of dust. The basement was damp, with low ceilings, from where old, cracked light bulbs hung. The dim light barely cut through the darkness, leaving most of the space in darkness. The walls, speckled with damp, radiated an oppressive sense of hopelessness. The door slammed shut with a thud, echoing off the stone walls, and I heard the key turn outside. Sunday. I shouted, but her footsteps were already receding. I was left alone, completely alone. The darkness and the cold held me in their icy embrace. Panic began to rise inside me, like a wave surging through my mind. What should I do? How do I get out of here? My head was spinning, and my breathing was getting more and more ragged. However, in the midst of this chaos, I felt something hard in the back pocket of my jeans. Oh, yes. I have it. I frantically groped for the object that could be my salvation. It was a small folding knife that I always carried with me just in case. Opening the door seemed impossible, but I knew that the main thing was to remain calm. My name is Olivia Anderson. I am 45 years old. I never would have thought that I would find myself in such a situation. Until recently, my life seemed quite ordinary. I worked as an administrative assistant in a small company where everything went on as usual. The work was not difficult, but it was satisfying. The colleagues were friendly, and every day spent in the office seemed easy and pleasant to me. However, his personal life left much to be desired. I had never been married, and it bothered me more than I was willing to admit even to myself. Thoughts of growing old alone haunted me, and anxiety for the future became obsessive. Perhaps that's why when James Anderson came into my life, I immediately felt hopeful. He was 9 years older, charming, confident, with such a warm look that next to him I wanted to believe in fairy tales. We met in the office. He was a representative of one of our client companies. Gradually, we began to communicate. Our conversations became longer and longer, until I realized that I had fallen in love. We got married a few years later. James turned out to be a caring husband, and I really hoped that we could build a cozy, warm house. He already had a daughter from his first marriage, Sandy. She looked shy, but it seemed to me that we could find a common language. I was so wrong. From the very beginning of our cohabitation, Sandy showed herself from a completely different side. Her coldness was replaced by outbursts of anger, and despite all my efforts, she remained withdrawn. I tried to create the perfect family atmosphere for them. I quit my job to spend more time at home, cooked balanced dinners, and kept clean. But all my efforts were shattered by her estrangement. Sunday avoided me. Her silence was sometimes unbearable. The only consolation was Oliver the cat, a chubby red-haired lazy man who always seemed to be on my side. His fluffy muzzle made you smile even on the hardest days. But now, sitting in this sinister basement, I wasn't thinking about the cat. The main thing is to find a way out. I gripped the knife tighter and looked around the room. In the dim light, I noticed an old staircase leading to a locked door. The chances were slim, but I couldn't just sit there. Every movement hurt, but I got to my feet. It's time to act. Although I had many tiring days ahead of me, I found solace in watching Oliver. His soft purring and the habit of lazily stretching out in the sunlight helped me feel a little peaceful. Life after the wedding was far from ideal, but I still felt happier than in those years when loneliness became my only companion. However, there was a shadow behind this fragile happiness that I couldn't ignore. Sandy, the girl I wanted to accept as my daughter from the very beginning, still kept me at a distance. She seemed cold and indifferent, ignoring my attempts to establish contact. Every time she came home, I greeted her with a smile, "Welcome home." But she received only a brief, almost contemptuous look in response, and Sunday went to her room without saying a word. Sometimes I tried to start a conversation. "How was school? Was there something interesting?" But Sunday remained impassive, as if my words were lost in the air. It made me feel even more isolated, like I was an extra link in their little family. At such moments, I consoled myself with the thought that she just hadn't gotten used to me yet. Sunday was at a difficult age when emotions sometimes get the better of reason. I thought she needed time to get used to my presence. But as the years passed, the situation did not change. Even after 4 years of living together, I knew very little about Sunday. She was still a mystery to me, although one thing was obvious to me: she adored Oliver. Sunday might not have noticed me, but as soon as the cat appeared on the horizon, her face shone with warmth. Sometimes I found myself thinking that I envied Oliver for how easily Sunday found common ground with him. Having got used to her silent contempt, I no longer expected anything new. So when Sunday suddenly spoke to me one day, it took me by surprise. Her voice, usually steeped in indifference, sounded strangely flat. "How long are you going to stay in this house?" Those words hit me like an icy squall. I tried to figure out what she meant, but before I could say anything, she continued, "I'm asking, how much longer do you plan to be here? Why can't you just leave?" Her words touched me to the core. I felt a sharp pain, but I couldn't find the right words. Sunday didn't stop. She kept talking, and with every word she said, the reason for her behavior became clearer to me. "Listen, I love my dad. It was always just the two of us, just him and me. And now there's you, an old woman who thinks she can replace my mom. You can't. And don't think that's what I want." I tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Sunday grinned as if enjoying her speech. "Did you think you could become a part of this family? Funny. I was hoping that if I ignored you long enough, you'd break down and leave. But you put up with everything. How annoying it is." I listened to her words and felt all my confidence go away. The hurtful phrases that Sandy threw with ease tore me apart. But the most painful thing was her look. There was a mixture of contempt and gloating in her eyes. "Do you know what you're doing? You're in the way. You will never be a part of our family." When she finished her tirade, a smile lit up her face, triumphant, victorious. It was the smile of a man who had achieved his goal. "I think you realize that there is no place for you here," she added, before turning around and walking away, leaving me alone in this silence. She had such negative feelings for me that it seemed as if there was an invisible wall between us, impenetrable and cold. Her hurtful words rang in my head like an echo that cannot be drowned out. "Think about your value." These words were especially painful. They bounced off the walls of my mind like hot coals, leaving burns on my self-esteem. Before I knew it, tears were running down my cheeks. What was the point of all these years? 5 years of trying to find a common language, create a cozy home, and in response only contempt. Every time I tried to talk to Sunday, she would turn away or respond with sarcasm. Still, I hoped that one day I could win her respect. But hope faded with each passing day as her attitude grew colder. Not only did she avoid me, but she also started openly mocking me. "Olivia, you're a really bad cook. It's just disgusting. I even feel sorry for Dad. He could have found someone better," she would say at dinner, idly picking at her plate with a fork. However, as soon as James entered the room, it changed. "Yes, Dad, it's delicious," she said with a smile, as if nothing had happened. I tried to hold on, but everything was bubbling inside. James, busy with his work, did not notice anything unusual. When he asked me, "What's wrong, Olivia?" I just waved him off, hiding my condition behind an artificial smile. "I'm happy, James, I'm really happy," I replied, hoping he wouldn't notice the tremor in my voice. But the happiness I was talking about seemed illusory. It was a complicated, painful feeling that defied any description. Sometimes I wanted to tell James everything, put my fears and pain on the table, but something stopped me. Perhaps it was the thought that he was already too busy. Perhaps it was the fear that he would consider my worries insignificant. I told myself that if I just waited, everything would get better. Someday Sunday will grow up, go to college, start her adult life. Then, perhaps, the silence in the house will finally become calm, and not emptiness. So 6 years have passed. Sunday went to college, found a job at a company not far from home. I had hoped that her adult life would distance us from each other, but instead her presence, albeit less frequent, became even more toxic. Her insults did not stop, even when James was away on long business trips. With each passing month, his trips became longer, first a couple of days, then weeks, and then months. When he was at home, Sunday held back, but his absence turned the house into a battlefield. "The food is terrible again," Sandy said, pushing her plate away. "Say something, Olivia. Or maybe you just don't know how," she would add with sharpness, leaving me in silence with my dinner cooling down. In those moments, I felt something crackling inside me. I endured for so many years, but one day it became clear to me, I can't do it anymore. That evening, when Sunday attacked me again with her reproaches, something in me broke. I looked up at her with a look that no longer had the usual humility. "Just go away already, Sunday," my voice broke into a scream that echoed through the room. It was a moment she didn't seem to have expected at all. Her face froze, her eyes widened in surprise. But I didn't stop. "You always say that I'm annoying, that I'm not good enough. If I'm that bad, why don't you leave? You have a job, money, and you're doing great on your own. And me? I'm a housewife. I can't just walk away." Her silence at that moment was louder to me than all her insults. For the first time in so many years, I managed to interrupt her stream of contempt. But this silence did not bring me relief. I could tell that Sunday was furious when she left me in this dank, sinister basement. A moment ago, her words had been filled with sarcastic energy, but now the silence spread around like a viscous, oppressive void. I frantically pounded on the cold concrete walls, my voice trembling with fear and indignation. "Hey! Let me out! You can't leave me here!" But my pleas broke on the silence like stones on the surface of a frozen lake. "You're not coming out of there," came Sunday's voice, filled with a strange mixture of determination and gloating. "This is your punishment for stealing my father from me." My heart started beating faster. The words, spoken with such ease, hit me harder than I expected. Her hatred, rooted and implacable, seemed to be something unchangeable, as if she had decided beforehand that I deserved only contempt. "Sunday, you can't do this," I exclaimed, trying to awaken some conscience in her. "It's dangerous. You don't understand what you're doing." But instead of answering, she ignored my screams and started walking away. I heard the sound of her retreating footsteps, then the door slammed and everything went quiet. The darkness around me seemed to have become denser, the air heavier. I started knocking again, but I knew it was useless. With her departure, I was left completely alone. My panic was growing by the second. The basement was damp, cold, and smelled musty. I couldn't stay here for 4 days. Thoughts raced chaotically through my head. "Oliver, what about Oliver?" flashed through my mind, but I immediately remembered her cold, almost indifferent answer. Oliver has an automatic feeder, don't worry. This phrase seemed to put an end to her complete disregard for everything that concerned me. In desperation, I ran my hand through my pocket and suddenly felt a familiar heaviness. Oh yes, my smartphone. With shaking hands, I took it out and quickly dialed the number of Linda, my closest friend. Linda, it's me. Olivia, my voice trembled like a string. Olivia? What happened? You rarely call, she sounded worried. I hurried to explain the situation, holding back the tears that were coming. Linda listened to me with obvious horror and immediately promised to come. A few weary minutes seemed like an eternity, but finally I heard the sound of footsteps overhead. Soon, the basement door opened and bright sunlight burst into the room. Olivia. Are you okay? Linda leaned toward me, her face expressing genuine concern. Thanks for coming, I whispered, feeling the lump in my throat begin to dissolve. She helped me out and we went to her house. Already in the warmth of her living room, I felt the tension slowly release me. But the thought of what had happened was haunting. James was on a business trip, and I knew I couldn't just wait for him to return without telling him what had happened. I texted him, describing everything that had happened, but I didn't dare ask him to interrupt the trip. However, a few minutes later he called me himself. Olivia, are you okay? His voice sounded worried. Yes, James, I'm fine. Linda helped me out. Listen, I'm going home right now. Wait at Linda's, I'll pick you up. His determination calmed me down, but deep down I felt that James's return would not solve all the problems. Linda, thank you for everything, I said, looking down. Don't worry, Olivia. You know, you have a really caring husband. I think Sunday might be jealous of your relationship with him. Her words stung me. Jealousy? But could jealousy explain everything I've been through? She's probably jealous that you married her beloved dad, so when it was mentioned, I realized that's exactly the case. Jealousy. It was a simple, clear fact that had always been hidden in her behavior, but now that Linda had said those words out loud, I realized how deep and inescapable this jealousy was. Sunday, this young, energetic woman with whom I once shared moments of family joy, always dreamed of being in the center of his world. And now that I was with him, when I became his wife, her place in his life was no longer the same as before. Linda was right. No matter how long James and I lived together, his relationship with Sunday, even years later, remained crucial to her. It wasn't just the usual feeling of jealousy, it was a struggle for a place next to him, a place that, in her opinion, rightfully belonged to her. And now, when I was trying to figure out her aggressive behavior, I realized that I shouldn't hold back. I have to fight for myself and for our family. You're right, Linda, I said the words out loud, but I wasn't fully aware of their meaning yet. I have to talk to Sunday, explain to her that she can't keep doing this. It won't help her or me. My head was full of plans and ideas, but I must admit, none of them seemed strong enough to handle the situation. I needed something more. I was puzzling over how to approach Sunday, how to get her to at least listen. It wasn't just a family problem, it was a question of how to keep the peace in our house, how to prevent her from destroying everything that James and I had built. I shared my plan with Linda, thinking for a moment before telling her how I was going to proceed. It was a pretty bold idea, but as Linda said, it's a really cool idea. She approved of my plan and offered to help, even though she was clearly surprised by everything that was happening. 2 hours later, James came to my house. I was surprised to see him, but I was ready to meet him. His eyes were full of concern, and he made no secret of his desire to help me, even if it meant leaving his job. Are you okay? What is it? He asked when he crossed the threshold. Yes, I'm fine, I replied, smiling slightly. But you were at work, what's wrong with her? You know that for me, work is not the main thing, James said, gently touching my shoulder. You are the most important thing. I decided to take a few days off. It's time to deal with Sunday. We sat down at the table, and I told him in detail what had happened in the basement, how I was trapped, and how Sunday had tricked me into setting up this whole show. James listened attentively without interrupting. His face was serious as he listened to me to the end. I'm sorry, he said finally, folding his arms over his chest. I should have noticed that something was wrong, but I didn't see it. And maybe it's my fault, too. But I should have realized what Sunday was hiding from us. I didn't know how to react to his words, but they were sincere, and I couldn't help but appreciate his willingness to admit his mistake. However, what was important now was to talk to Sunday, to understand exactly what she was up to and how to solve this problem. I'm going to talk to her, I said decisively. It needs to be done right now. Linda intervened again with a mocking wink. Yes, shake her up. And don't hold back. It's time to put everything in its place. Her words were like a flash that lit up my path. I was ready. We thanked Linda for her support and went home to the place where we were going to meet Sunday. When we returned to the house, James immediately took off his coat and said, I'll be there for you if you want. But you have to talk to Sunday yourself. You're right, she needs to be shaken up, otherwise she won't understand where she belongs. I nodded. We decided to leave the window next to the basement open so we could keep an eye on her return. Time passed slowly, and every moment of waiting increased the tension. Finally, the taxi stopped in front of the house, and I saw her. Sunday got out with her luggage, unaware of what was waiting for her. James and I were standing spying on her when she came to the basement door. I knew my plan was going to work. The basement, which was once just an abandoned place for punishing games for her, has now become a real nightmare. I arranged everything so that this basement would seem not only dirty, but also rotting, smelling of a terrible smell, as if someone really died in it. Actually, of course, there was no smell of death, but I was sure that Sunday would succumb to fear. As soon as she reached the door, her reaction was instantaneous. Oh, my God, what is that smell? Her face changed, and she opened the basement door with a frown. As soon as Sunday entered the basement, her face froze in shock. She didn't expect to see what I had prepared for her. With an expression on her face like I've never seen before, she turned to us. What did you do? She said with a tremor in her voice. Hi, Sunday, James said with the most stern expression I've ever seen on his face. We need to talk. Sunday seemed to understand everything. She was sitting on the couch, her body completely collapsed by the weight of what was happening, and her face was depressed, as if she realized that she had gone too far and would not be able to return. There was a strange silence in the room, as if everything around was frozen in anticipation of the inevitable. James, without taking his eyes off her, finally spoke. You did some terrible things to Olivia, he said, and his voice was low but full of inner pain. Sunday was silent, her eyes glistening with tears, but she couldn't find the words. James and I stood watching her reaction, trying to figure out how this could have happened. I couldn't believe that she could actually forget what she had done. You panicked earlier, thinking that maybe Olivia died down there in the basement, James continued, his voice becoming a little sharper. But it's not like that. Then why did you look so scared in front of that scary basement? Sunday took a deep breath and didn't seem to expect herself to reveal such a truth. She pressed her hands to her chest as if trying to calm herself before speaking. I thought Oliver was inside, her voice trembled. I thought Oliver got into the basement and couldn't get out. I was sure of it. You're right, I should have been worried about Olivia when I locked her up. It would have happened if I hadn't come back. I forgot. Her words hung in the air. We stood in complete disbelief, trying to comprehend what we had just heard. How could you forget about the man you locked in the basement for 4 whole days? How could you be so indifferent, so selfish? I felt a wave of resentment and confusion wash over me. James was also silent, his gaze becoming colder and colder, and the inner tension was growing. I can't believe you forgot about this, James said, his voice full of disappointment. You left her there, locked in the basement, and you forgot. You didn't even try to find her. You were ready to leave her there until the worst happened. Sunday opened her mouth to defend herself, but James wouldn't let her continue. Wait a minute. Are you going to make excuses? He said, his gaze getting sharper and sharper. You did something that could have serious consequences just because you wanted to. And now you're trying to put the blame on Olivia? Sunday paused. She couldn't answer. She couldn't justify her actions because deep down she knew that nothing she said would change what happened. James was right, her actions defied explanation. I never thought you'd be like this, he said with genuine disappointment. I raised you, and I thought that you would be the best, that you would understand the responsibility for your actions. And now you're sitting here and trying to blame everything on others? Sunday shuddered, her eyes filled with tears. She stood up and tried to defend herself, but James was adamant. Dad, don't say such things, her voice trembled with anger and despair. I just love you very much. If Olivia had just waited silently for 4 days, would have let her out. If she hadn't called her friends, none of this would have happened. Dad didn't have to leave work, take a day off. Her words were full of pain, but they seemed so selfish that I couldn't understand how she could do this. She tried to justify herself, not admitting her own guilt, shifting it to me, to Olivia. But it wasn't about what I could do, it was about what she might not do. Maybe if you hadn't locked me up, she continued, her voice getting more and more strained, you wouldn't have found out the truth. You're the one who made me feel like I was a stranger. You took my dad away from me, and now you're blaming everything on me. Everything that happened is your fault. I stood there, not knowing what to say. It was so absurd that I could hardly take her words seriously. Sunday didn't realize how destructive her actions were, how much they could harm not only me, but everyone around me. That's enough, James interjected, and his voice was low and threatening. You can't act like that. You can't put the blame on others and you're responsible for everything that happened. You don't understand how dangerous your behavior was. You put another person's life in danger and forgot about everything. Sunday was stunned. She hadn't expected this turn of events, and her face was distorted with emotion. She was crying, clinging to James, but his gaze was full of alienation. Just get out of this house, he said coldly, and his words sounded like a sentence. I can't keep someone here who, on a whim, endangers another person's life, and then forgets about everything and continues to behave as if nothing had happened. Sunday clenched her fists, her face flushed with anger and despair, but she didn't say anything. She got up and silently left the house, leaving James and me in silence. Leave now, James whispered, and his voice was as cold as ice, filled with a determination that was so sharp it felt like it could cut through the space between us. Do you think you have the right to speak? You really don't think about anyone but yourself. Sunday froze, but instead of leaving, she took a step forward, as if hoping that her words could make a difference. She raised her hands, as if trying to find salvation in persuading James, although her very posture was full of despair. But he didn't look at her, brushing her off like an annoying insect. No, it's no use, I said, and my words hung in the air. Just leave, like James said. Stop clinging to me. I looked at her, and despite all the drama of the situation, I felt a weight settle in my soul. Sunday muttered something under her breath, but her words became too quiet to be heard. She turned to me, her gaze full of pleading. Olivia, please say something. You understand me, don't you? But I couldn't justify her anymore. All I could say was a quiet, no, it's useless. You're really only thinking about yourself." Her face contorted in pain, and she turned to the door without a word. James and I watched her leave. Sunday pulled her suitcase out of the corner and headed for the exit. She didn't turn around even as her figure disappeared through the door. It seemed to me that her silhouette became lonely for a moment, but strangely I felt no pity. As soon as the door closed, an eerie silence reigned in the house. The tension that had been building up for years finally seemed to dissipate, but it left behind a feeling of awkwardness. James sat down heavily on the couch, his body bent over as if the full weight of this moment had fallen on him. "I'm sorry, Olivia," he said after a long pause, his voice strangled, full of regret. "I had to see what was going on. I should have done something earlier." I sat down next to him, and despite his feelings, I couldn't agree with his self-accusation. "It's not like that. It's not your fault, James." Sunday hid her actions well, and I didn't say anything. I tried to comfort him, although I felt pain that we both didn't notice how far she had gone. "We both share some of the blame, but it's not your fault." James sighed, rubbing his temples as if his mind was trying to find a solution that was eluding him. "I should have been more attentive. As her father, I had to figure out what was wrong with her." He paused, and then continued as if that was the only thing he could say, "We can't change the past. We need to move forward and hope that Sunday learns a lesson from this." I nodded, trying to calm him down. Inside, I also understood that this situation takes time to fix everything that has been done. But I believed that we had a chance for the future. "You're right," I said. "We can't change what happened. But all we need to do now is move on." James sighed and looked at me again. His gaze softened, and I felt the tension in his body begin to subside. "I'll contact her in a few days, when everything calms down a bit. Maybe someday I'll talk to her, explain how much she was wrong." He didn't say it with fury, but rather with sadness, realizing that this would be a difficult conversation for Sunday. I nodded, and at that moment I felt that our house had regained a piece of peace. Although the separation from Sunday was painful, it may have been necessary. We needed time to relive everything that had happened and figure out how to build our lives further. The following days were a mixture of relief and sadness. It became easier to breathe in the house without Sunday, but her presence sometimes felt like an emptiness that was not filled with anything. I took care of Oliver, who seemed to feel the changes and became more attached to me. He was there, as if he was also looking for comfort. James took a few more days off to be with me. We spent a lot of time together discussing the future, plans, how to rebuild our relationship, and what to do if Sunday ever decides to return. We tried to find ways to strengthen what was left and rebuild the trust that had been so undermined. One evening, as we were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, James turned to me. "Thank you for enduring all this," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "I know it wasn't easy. But we're together, and we'll get through this." I squeezed his hand and smiled. "It wasn't easy," I replied. "But we're together, and that's the main thing." We sat in silence, absorbed in these simple words. In that silence, I felt that despite everything that had happened, we had found each other again, and it gave me hope. 2 long, hard, but necessary weeks have passed. Sunday called. Her voice sounded calmer, although there was still a hint of defiance in it. They talked for a long time. James assured her that he still loved her, but also made it clear that her actions had serious consequences. When the conversation ended, James said that she had agreed to seek counseling and apologized for her behavior. It was a small but important step. We all knew it would be difficult to restore trust, but this was the beginning. Life was gradually returning to its new normal. James and I focused on strengthening our marriage, trying to create a favorable atmosphere in the house, which became a shelter for us from the storms raging around. Despite everything that had happened, I believed that we could be happy again if we worked on ourselves and our relationship. Sunday stayed away for a while, giving herself the opportunity to grow and reflect. It was important to her, and to us too. As the months passed, and although the wounds still hurt, they began to heal, and the pain became less acute every day. Sunday came to visit us sometimes, and every time she showed up, James and I felt the same tension that we had before. But now that tension was less destructive. We were careful, but at the same time full of hope that over time we could find a way to coexist peacefully and maybe even become closer to each other as a family. There were still questions and doubts, but it seemed that this path was the only possible one. I've been getting a lot of emails and calls from Sunday. There was nothing new in her messages. They kept repeating the same thing: "I'm sorry, please forgive me." These letters arrived at different times of the day, without any schedule. Sometimes it seemed to me that she sent them just like that, out of habit, or out of a sense of guilt that never let her go. Her messages became more and more insistent. She told me where she lived, how she was coping. She admitted that her life was not so simple. She rented cheap rooms in motels, constantly complaining about dirty bathrooms and high rents. It was hard to believe that a man who had been used to comfort all his life was now facing such difficulties. I tried to figure out what was behind her words, but all I saw was her selfishness. She was too focused on herself and her discomfort to realize that her actions had hurt us. James also received the same messages from Sunday. He was stunned and confused, not knowing how to feel about it. He said that either she really couldn't handle herself, or she was too selfish to see reality. But honestly, even if her situation was terrible, I couldn't let Sunday come back to our house. I wasn't ready to relive the same feelings, the same pain that came with her presence. James and I needed time to restore at least a minimum of calm in our home. After Sunday left, life began to run its course again. James continued his business trips, but not as often as before. We started spending more time together, and it was a real gift. We relaxed without fear of unnecessary conversations, without trying to hide our feelings. It was nice just to be there, not weighing every word and not being afraid that someone might misunderstand us. The days I spent with James became a source of joy for me. All I needed was to rest on the couch, where Oliver would climb on my stomach, meow, and curl up. These moments were real treasures, and I hoped that there would be many more such moments. But Sunday wouldn't leave us alone. The flow of her messages became more and more intrusive. Every day I received several letters with apologies and stories about her difficulties. She complained about her life in motels, dirty bathrooms, and high rents. It was all too familiar, her eternal nagging, her desire to live up to her standards, even if it cost her a lot of effort. Sometimes I thought that she would just have to accept reality, and not live in a world where her ideals turn out to be impossible. But she couldn't figure it out. Her self-centered approach overshadowed everything else. She sent the same messages to James. He was confused, and there was not only anxiety in his words, but also bewilderment. He noted that either she can't handle it on her own, or her selfishness is so great that she sees no boundaries. He was worried about her, but he was ready to put an end to it. He was willing to give her time, but no more. I felt that the moment had come when I needed to stop. James and I needed time to figure out what was going to happen next, and I wasn't ready to let Sunday come back to this house if her return would mean even more pain and tension. She should have realized that her actions were not without consequences. We needed time to realize that what is important for all of us is not going back to the past, but the opportunity to move forward. And to do this, she had to go her own way, and maybe someday she will understand what mistakes she made, and how important it is to be aware of them in order to move forward. Once again, I hoped that this time Sunday would be able to find the strength to grow up and change for the better, despite all the trials she has been through. But no matter how difficult it was, I wanted to believe that this pause would bring her not only an awareness of her mistakes, but also an understanding of the importance of change. After Sunday left, our house became a place of calm and relaxation, free from the old tension. James's work trips became less frequent, which gave us more time to be together. We no longer tiptoed around her moods, trying to guess when the next explosion would come. Now every moment we spent together was filled with peace. The moments of silence we shared were valuable. We did not strive for verbosity, we did not need explanations. Whether we were having dinner in front of the TV, or just sitting in silence, each such moment brought joy, creating that harmony that we lacked so much before. I felt the space around me fill up, as all the shadows of the past disappeared, and we were finally able to be ourselves. At such moments, it seemed to me that the world became a little easier for us, and we began to feel the joy of simple, but such important things. One evening, after completing all the household chores, I settled down on the couch with little Oliver. The cat, sensing my calmness, jumped up to me and settled on my stomach, meowing softly and curling up. I stroked him, enjoying his soft fur, feeling his quiet purr, which seemed to remind me of a universe full of love and warmth. At such moments, I felt that all I ever wanted was to be here and now, with those who are dear to me. Everything else receded into the background. My thoughts slowly wandered into the future, imagining more days like this, full of peace and contentment. I was thinking about how James and I could continue to strengthen our bond, making up for all the lost moments we spent dealing with Sunday's problems. Perhaps even returning to familiar things, to our old hobbies, could be a step towards a new life. I also hoped that Sunday, wherever she was, would one day find her way. And I couldn't help but hope that, despite all the difficulties, she would learn to take responsibility for her actions. We all learn from our mistakes one way or another, and I believe that she would go through this process too. Life always throws up unexpected obstacles for us. It didn't seem like anything new anymore, but now I knew that we were capable of overcoming everything that came our way. We came out of these trials stronger and wiser. The future seemed bright and full of possibilities. It beckoned with its unexplored nature, and I was ready to accept it with open arms, with the confidence that, despite all that we had experienced, we would go forward supporting each other. Oliver shifted slightly, adjusting his position on my stomach before settling back down. His warmth and gentleness were a comforting reminder to me of how important it is to appreciate what is and not let the storms of life overshadow the light of simple joys. I continued stroking him, feeling his body relax under my hands. In those moments, I felt grateful for the peace that had come into our lives. And I knew that we could withstand any difficulties if we held on to each other. Days turned into weeks, and our lives continued to improve. James' presence at home was of great importance. His attention and care created an atmosphere of love and support around us. We started spending more time together, discovering new hobbies, taking long walks in the park, discussing books and movies. We even started planning several short trips, which was a real discovery for us. It was like a second honeymoon, a time when we could reconnect and strengthen our life together. From time to time, James contacted Sunday, encouraging her to seek help and offering long-distance support. I could see that he still cared about her, despite everything that had happened. But he also understood that it takes time for her to change, and she must learn to grow and take responsibility for her actions. It was a difficult situation, but we began to talk about Sunday more reassuringly, as a person capable of change, rather than as someone who had made irreparable mistakes. Moments of silence became for me a time of deep reflection. I have often thought about how far we have come during this period. Our journey was difficult, but it brought James and me closer together. We have learned to communicate better, support each other in difficult moments, and appreciate moments of peace that were previously inaccessible to us. Oliver remained a constant source of joy and comfort. His playful antics and affectionate nature filled the house with light. He was living proof that even in the darkest of times, you can find light if you look around. The seasons have changed, and our worldview has changed. We were no longer burdened by the past, but we were looking forward to a future full of new opportunities. Every day was a chance to build the world we found and create a life that would eventually be our own. We had been through the storm, and despite all its consequences, I was confident that, with James by our side and with the love we shared, we would be able to withstand everything that came our way. The future was bright, and I was ready to meet it with all my heart.